Both Russia and Ukraine have promised new offensives for the spring. So, is the war entering a decisive phase? That was President Joe Biden speaking in Kiev earlier this week. His visit was a striking gesture of solidarity from the United States towards Ukraine. The US president brought with him promises of new forms of weaponry, including tanks, missiles, and armored vehicles. But the Ukrainians are still pressing for fighter planes and longer-range missiles. They hope to make a decisive breakthrough in the next few months. So when I got Chris Miller on the line from Kiev, I started by asking him how he expects the war to unfold over the coming months.
I think we've been in this strange state now for several months where there hasn't been a lot of movement on or across the front line, which is predominantly in the south and the east. If you remember, there was this major Ukrainian offensive in the autumn where the Ukrainians regained a lot of ground outside of Kherson in the south and over in Kharkiv in the east. And since then, the lines really have solidified. No matter what the Russians have done, throwing tens of thousands of newly mobilized soldiers at the fight, bringing in these mercenaries from the Wagner Group, they haven't really been able to penetrate Ukrainian lines and push beyond the front line that they've held now for several months. And so there's been this heavy missile bombardment since October. And, it's gone on for now several months. And the idea, at least what it seemed to be on the Russian side, was that, okay, if we can't beat the Ukrainians on the front line, we'll bring up these mobilized soldiers, train them up, and get ready for a late winter or early spring offensive, which would bring us to around this time. And in the meantime, we'll freeze out the Ukrainians by using these missiles to knock out power infrastructure, turn off the lights, turn off the heating, cut off the water supplies, and make life just totally unbearable for Ukrainians. But that hasn't really happened. I think that has surprised quite a few people, not necessarily the resilience of the Ukrainians, which we've come to know all too well over the last year, but the fact that I think the Ukrainians' air defense systems have continued to work very successfully, that they've gotten these new air defense systems from their Western partners. That has certainly helped. And because of that, we've seen this sort of stalemate. I think if you talk to Ukrainian intelligence like I did last week, or you listen to analysts who are watching very closely, this Russian winter or spring offensive has already begun. It's been underway now for a couple of weeks, but it hasn't made much progress. I guess to come back to your original question, what are we going to see over the next months? I think Ukraine really sees a window of opportunity where it can try its hand at regaining some of the ground that it has lost. The goal, of course, is to liberate all of the territory that is under Russian occupation and that has been captured by Russia in the last year, but not only. Kiev has been very outspoken about its ultimate goal to recapture all of the Donbass, those territories in eastern Ukraine that Russia has occupied since 2014, as well as the Crimean Peninsula. So the goal this year is to regain everything.
So the picture you portray of the Ukrainians is, despite everything, reasonably upbeat. Is it something of a surprise that this Russian spring offensive, or winter offensive, I guess February, has not really got as far as people wanted? And are we confident that this is all the Russians have? That was sort of what the British Defense Secretary suggested when he was talking to the FT in Munich. He said, this is it. They can't do much more. Is that your impression?
Yes and no. The Russian offensive has, I think it's safe to say, at least at this point, fallen flat. Without a significant influx of troops or bringing in a significant increase of weapons and throwing all it has at the fight, I don't think they're going to advance any further than they currently are. I mean, they've been trying to capture the city of Bakhmut since last May. And really, in the last few months, they've scaled up their offensive there, and they still haven't had much luck. They've taken some little towns and villages around the city, but those are very sparsely populated anyway. It's open terrain. It's not that difficult to capture these little villages along some of the highways there. So they haven't had a lot of success. I think one of the concerns is that they have deeper resources. They have more ammunition than the Ukrainians have. And so if this becomes a game of who can fight the longest, then Russia may have the upper hand. It's just going to have deeper resources, certainly more people if Putin decides to announce another wave of mobilization. The Ukrainians are being largely supplied by the West at this point. They've almost completely expended their entire weapons cache of Soviet-era arms and ammunition, and they really need a massive influx of Western weaponry and ammunition to continue the fight. And so if this is a war that drags on beyond the spring and the summer and even beyond 2023 into 2024, it's going to become a battle of endurance. And at that point, the big question will be, how long is the West able and willing to continue backing Ukraine in this fight?
Yeah. I mean, the Russian tactics have been, some people have compared them to the First World War, these wave tactics, expending huge numbers of soldiers and lives in Bakhmut, a town that you know very well. I mean, you used to work there and you've been up there during the fighting. It must be tragic to see the destruction of a place that you lived and worked in.
It is. I'm American. I'm not Ukrainian, but I did move to Ukraine in 2010, and I lived in Bakhmut when it was still called Artyomsk for 2 years. And I made a lot of very close friends there. I worked in the city's schools and library and with some NGOs there. And so I know the place very well. I know what kind of place it became over the last decade. And there was a lot of promise, and there were a lot of really incredibly smart young people, and it was a vibrant little city. And when I returned this summer, and then again in October and December, it was almost completely destroyed and a shell of its former self. And this was a city of more than 70,000 people, maybe 80,000 people even. And now there's maybe 5,000 people. It was a ghost town. My old apartment had a giant artillery shell hole in it. The city roads were all torn up. There was just debris everywhere. And that was all the evidence of this really brutal fight that has been waged there over the past several months. The Ukrainians are doing everything they can to hold on, but what they're facing are, like you said, these waves of fighters that the Russians are sending in. And it is very much a World War I style battle. It's grueling.
And presumably the children you taught and the friends you made have been scattered all over the country or outside Ukraine, and perhaps some of them killed in the fighting.
Yeah, unfortunately, some of them have lost their lives, some earlier on in the fight in 2014 and 15 when the war first broke out. I had some former students of mine who had been killed by landmines over the years. And in the past year, I've discovered that some of my former students had joined the fight after February 24th and are serving in various units of the Ukrainian military now. One student of mine who was 16 when I met him, he was a senior in high school, is now in his, later 20s, and he's a military medic who just underwent training to train new military medics. And he's been on the front lines in eastern Ukraine for all of this year, and we talk pretty regularly about just how intense it is and how important it is to him to be a part of this fight, and how his mother is very proud of him, but not a big fan of him being so close to the battles. And, she had lost her husband a few years back, and all that she has left is him. His name is Bogdan, and he feels it's really important to do this. So there are people like him who I know who are very much a part of the fight. Others are fighting in other ways, part of the volunteer organizations that are raising money for supplies, things like drones or medical equipment. Others have joined the United Nations or other humanitarian organizations to help provide food, shelter, those types of things to people. But almost everyone I know is involved in some way now. This war has mobilized all of Ukrainian society, and even those who fled to safety in Western Ukraine or in Europe are finding a way, to help their home, and are still holding out hope that they can return to some semblance of normalcy in the not so distant future.
Now, a lot of what Russia has argued from the beginning, continues to argue, is that area in the east of Ukraine, that a lot of people there actually, they're Russian speakers. They look to Russia. They don't look to Kiev. Did that sentiment exist? Do traces of it still exist? Was this a divided society?
Well, I'm not sure if I would use the word divided, but I would say people had various loyalties. When I first moved there, what I found was a really strong regional identity. This part of eastern Ukraine, known as the Donbass, is, composed of native Russian speakers and native Ukrainian speakers. And it was always a Ukrainian speaking place until really the industrialization period in the early 20th century, when Russia sent in Russian speakers to work the mines and the steel plants there. And so Russian became the dominant language. But if you get outside of the cities, you would run into people who were speaking Ukrainian, or in the case of several of the villages that I taught in or met people in, they even spoke what was called Surzhyk, which is this mix of Russian and Ukrainian. And when I would speak to them about politics and about where their loyalties lied, a lot of them identified strongly with the region and were always skeptical of the national centers. They felt as though they were ignored by both Moscow and Kiev, that the capitals would use them for their steel, their taxes, and not put much money back into building up the region. So they felt very isolated. And I think that sort of isolation or even alienation worked in Russia's favor in 2014 when there just weren't enough people to rise up in Ukraine's defense and fight back. There weren't as many Russia supporters as there were in Crimea, when Russia very easily and almost without firing a single bullet annexed Crimea after its stealth invasion. But because Kiev had not really reached out to the East after its revolution in 2014 and said something along the lines of, let's build this new future without a corrupt president together, they weren't really sure about where they should go. Now, that's not to say that there weren't protests and there weren't people who were, very pro-Ukrainian or pro-Kiev. Those people did exist. But it was fertile for Russia's propaganda and this stealth invasion of unmarked troops that sparked the war at first. But over the years, the Donbass became very patriotic, and it was filled with people who were pro-Ukrainian. And a lot of people, including many of my friends, made a conscious choice to switch from speaking Russian to speaking Ukrainian as their dominant language. And that was because what Russia did out there, which was continue to fuel this war that dragged on and on and on until it exploded into this full-scale invasion again in February of last year.
And coming back to the present, it was interesting talking to some of the strategists who assembled at this Munich Security Conference last week. Some felt that perhaps Ukraine should now withdraw from Bakhmut, that they too were taking very heavy casualties, that it wasn't of such strategic significance that they had to keep fighting. But it seems to be of enormous symbolic significance. How do you see the future of this battle for Bakhmut?
I think the symbolic importance right now is outweighing the strategic importance for the Ukrainians. Zelensky himself, President Zelensky, has used the phrase Bakhmut holds and referred to the city as a fortress or Fortress Bakhmut. And it's now become this battle cry for the Ukrainians. And the Russians have not seen a significant battlefield victory for months. And taking Bakhmut would still provide Putin the sort of propaganda victory that he would get if he were to say, we've taken the city of Bakhmut, after what was a pretty long struggle. I think the Ukrainians don't see necessarily a lot of strategic value in it, but the symbolic importance is huge. And the Ukrainians are actually doing a very good job of holding the Russians back right now without expending a lot of their materiel that they're getting from the West. What I've been told by some of the commanders and soldiers on the ground around Bakhmut is that for the last few weeks, they've actually seen the Russians pull back some of their stronger fighters and use these mobilized forces in trying to overwhelm in sheer number the Ukrainians. But the Ukrainians are having great success in mowing them down with machine guns and smaller mortars, and they're not having to use a lot of this new Western weaponry that's coming in. So if they can continue to do that without losing ground that could lead to their encirclement there, what I've been told is that they're going to continue to do so. But they have dug in new positions all around Bakhmut, and certainly if Bakhmut isn't itself strategic, the cities just to the west of it are, those being Konstantinovka, Slavyansk, and Kramatorsk. These are all cities that some of the folks listening to us now will have probably heard about because they are of great importance strategically and culturally to both Ukraine and to Putin, who's used them in his speeches. And so that's the goal of Russia, is to take these towns. And the only way the Ukrainians are going to retreat from Bakhmut is if they absolutely have to.
And I mean, obviously, that's the battle of the moment, and you've explained very clearly why it's so important to both sides. But everybody is now, having talked about the possible Russian offensive, focused on the possible Ukrainian offensive. We've touched upon it. And Presumably they want to contain the element of surprise and so on, so nobody can be quite sure what they're going to do. But do they now feel they've got what they need to press ahead?
I think they feel as though they have been promised what they need to press ahead. A lot of what they're able to do in regards to their desired counteroffensive will depend largely on what gets here and when it gets here. And they are tight-lipped about what exactly they want to do, but I think it's fair to say that certainly one goal is to try to cut the Russians off from Russia's mainland, between Russia's mainland and occupied Crimea. There's this section in the southeast where the Ukrainians have had success in recapturing territory. They have seen some weaknesses in Russia's defenses down there, and that is one very likely point where they will attack. Also up in the northeast around Kharkiv region. What they decide to do and when they decide to do it, I think will largely depend on when these new tanks and weaponry arrive. We've already seen, I think, some of the U.S. Bradley fighting vehicles arrive. Some soldiers were sending images and videos of them around on social media in the last 48 hours or so. So some of it is there. And we might see evidence of the start of a Ukrainian offensive soon. Again, the weather is a factor. The ground is thawing right now. It's the famous Rasputitsa season where the winter ground thaws, everything gets really, really muddy, and everybody has a hard time moving. And I think that also is allowing the Ukrainians to lobby their Western partners, get new weaponry. As soon as the ground hardens up a little bit and Ukraine has a little bit more of what it needs, I think they certainly will launch some sort of offensive because time, as we said earlier, is likely on Russia's side, not Kiev's.
But we saw in the Russian offensive a year ago when they attacked Kiev that tanks can be very vulnerable. Are the Ukrainians confident that they're not going to be caught in the same kind of trap that the Russians were?
I think what the Ukrainians are really good at is using the tanks as part of an offensive, not solely as vehicles that would be leading one. The Ukrainians have done just incredible things, utilizing everything from commercial drones to larger Turkish-made drones, some of their own drones, in cooperation with some of their mechanized brigades that are operating heavy artillery or their armored vehicles, as well as the Western shoulder-fired rockets that have been very successful in taking out Russia's own tanks. So these combined forces that the Ukrainians have, we've seen them be used with great success around Kharkiv, around Kherson in the fall. I think certainly the vehicles that they're going to be getting and the weapons they're going to be getting now are arguably even better than what they had at that time. So it's certainly possible that they could be very successful. And, one of the things that the Ukrainians have proven to be very good at is adapting and learning very quickly. Sometimes that's being trained in the UK or Germany, and other times it's just being really good at finding a YouTube video that shows you how to operate a shoulder-fired Javelin missile and then putting it to good use.
So to summarize, Chris, with the anniversary of the Russian full-scale assault on Ukraine this week, it must be a very bittersweet moment for the Ukrainians. Terrible destruction, loss of life, but they've surprised everybody, perhaps even themselves. And from the sound of what you're saying, they're cautiously optimistic about what's going to happen in the war in the year ahead.
Yeah, I think that's right. The first line of Ukraine's national anthem is "Ukraine has not yet perished." And I think that describes very well this moment. Nobody believed that Kiev would stand, or very few believed that Kiev would stand. Many people thought it would fall, and fall even in a few days or a couple of weeks. And it not only remained in Kiev's hands, but Ukrainians managed to repel the Russian blitzkrieg, push Russian forces back even farther.
Almost a year after Ukraine has been invaded by Russia, Ukraine has continued to thwart the Russian invasion, defying all the expectations. And many have praised President Zelensky's communication skills as a key reason for their success. But it's not the only reason. It's much more complicated than that. So how has President Zelensky been able to unify Ukrainians, galvanize the rest of the world against the Russian aggression from Vladimir Putin? Jessica Pinzano is an associate professor of politics at the New School for Social Research, and she's an associate of the Davis Center for Russian and Eurasian Studies at Harvard University, has a very powerful piece in Politico magazine, and joins us on the line. Jessica, thanks so much for jumping on with us today.
Hi, Boyd. It's my pleasure. Thanks for inviting me.
So give us some perspective. I think everyone sees kind of this Churchillian things that we see of President Zelensky and his greens and fatigues and speaking to the world. Give us a little bit of behind the headlines, behind the things that we tend to see on social media. What really is it that makes him tick as a leader?
It's a great question. I can't claim to know exactly what makes him tick, right? What goes on inside his head. But I think one thing that that it would benefit us to understand is that he has been at this project of national unity for going on about 30 years now. Ukrainians have known Zelensky, at least Russian-speaking Ukrainians have known Zelensky for years before Russians had ever heard the name Vladimir Putin. Zelensky did, improv work on television, and specifically, he and his team were engaged in a project of building Ukrainian unity in a very polarized society over a number of years before he entered politics.
And that's such an important thing that this was not an instant leadership session with President Zelensky. And you actually pointed out in your piece some of the things that took place right after Russia's annexation of Crimea back in 2014. Describe that to us a little bit.
That's right. So Zelensky and his comedy troupe had always done political satire. So they always were commenting on the foibles of Ukrainian politicians, of Russian, other kinds of Russian aggression, the hybrid kind as opposed to the hot kind, and a lot of other topics. But in 2014, when Russia annexed Crimea and sent material and troops into the Donbass, Zelensky and his group started working really hard to develop a sense of Ukrainian identity that was really inclusive and could include not just people who were ethnically Ukrainian or who spoke Ukrainian at home, but also really reached out to people who felt like people in the capital were kind of sometimes ignoring them, people who spoke Russian at home, people who lived in industrial cities in the east and south. And they created a kind of way of thinking about being Ukrainian that was inclusive and really leaned into the idea that Ukrainians did not need to agree about policy to be able to work together. It's a kind of a situation that in some ways Americans might find very similar, right, to where Ukrainians were a few years ago. And Zelensky really offered a solution to that. And it took a few years. But he really got everyone on board, and now Ukrainian identity looks really different than it did a few years ago.
I think
with everyone really feeling love for their country.
Yeah, I love that, and we could take a lesson from that, and maybe we need him to tour the United States so that we can focus on this idea that it doesn't have to be about demonizing those that disagree with you, that there's so much that pulls us together. But you pointed out something that I just want to kind of double down on a little bit, that this was a lot of hard work and heavy lifting beyond just being funny and having a comedy show. He really was going after this identity, this inclusive identity of what it means to be Ukrainian.
He really was. And it also bears mentioning, and this is something I don't mention in the piece, but the people he worked with, he sort of, his loyalty and love of country also extended to the people around him. So the people that he ended his career on the stage with were many of the very same people he started his career with decades before. And he sort of stayed with them and worked with them. And they cultivated these ideas. One of the most important ideas that they articulated from the stage was the idea that, so Ukraine is a little bit like the United States, again, in the sense that each city and region is really different from the others. And they each have their very sort of specific local identities and local, civic organizations and the role of local business. And he and his troupe, they really kind of elevated that. And so at the same time as the Ukrainian government was doing these policies of decentralization to put more power in the hands of communities, Zelensky and his team from the stage were sort of talking about all the wonderful things about different cities' accents and dialects and what the advantages of different places were. And it was very inclusive and really, they even included, Russia-occupied areas in their songs when they talked about Ukrainian identity and Ukrainian identities. And that's one of the reasons why the country arguably has been able to unify right now, because no one felt left out.
Yeah, I love that. And you pointed out in his 2020 New Year's greeting that what did he end up delivering it in five different languages, I think, or more.
Well,
Go ahead.
yeah, he gave it mainly in Ukrainian, but he spoke sentences, and this was really unprecedented for a Ukrainian president. He spoke sentences in the languages Crimean Tatars. He spoke in Hungarian, which is the language that is spoken by many people in southwest of Ukraine, and he also spoke a sentence in Russian. And beyond that, he also broke down Ukrainian identities in all these different ways that are not traditional, right? He talked about language and ethnic identity, but he also talked about, maybe you're someone who didn't watch Game of Thrones. Maybe you're someone who doesn't use plastic. Maybe you're someone who doesn't like to pay your taxes. He helps people think about Ukraine, and he ended by saying, we're all people, right? And we're all imperfect, but we can all care about each other.
Yeah, so important. And I think that leads to, I think, where the real power seems to be emanating, at least from my perspective, and you pointed out this really powerfully, that he invited the people of Ukraine to a patriotism that was not exclusive to either that identity or to any kind of racial or faith-based or anything else. This inclusive patriotism has been a really powerful force in the country.
That's absolutely right. And, it's something we saw over this past winter when Zelensky addressed Ukrainians over social media during the winter holidays, where he did announcements for Hanukkah, he did announcements for the different Orthodox calendars. He talks about religion also in the same very inclusive way. And so he really, it's not a kind of milquetoast general identity. It's that he really validates the fact that there are lots of different kinds of people in the country, and they all have a place at the table.
Yeah, so important. And finally, before I let you go, Jessica, just looking at kind of his ability to speak truth to power, that's kind of where you conclude. But his ability to do it in a really unique way, I think all the way back to the beginning where he told President Biden he didn't need a ride. He needed some guns and ammunition.
That's right. Yeah, Zelensky, and I did this a few years ago, Inference and others have as well, and Zelensky recently used the metaphor of David and Goliath. But there's also, another metaphor from the ancient world of Diogenes and Alexander, where, the great military leader approaches the cynic who says, please step out of my light, please just get out of my way, right? And that's what Zelensky is sort of trying to make the Russian president do, just leave the Ukrainians alone so they can get on with their lives.